Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and coming up on today's programme, progress is being reported in the talks aimed at brokering a long-awaited ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas. Sources say that deal could be imminent. An estimated 10,000 North Korean troops are reported to be supporting Russia's war effort against Ukraine. Kyiv claims to have captured 2 of them and is touting a prisoner swap. Also coming up, we'll be getting all the latest on the LA wildfires, which reports say could be the second most destructive in California's history. Plus, just days before the US President-elect Donald Trump takes office, Special Counsel Jack Smith says his upcoming presidential title is the only thing that's keeping him out of prison. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on the progress of the talks being mediated by Qatar, Egypt and the United States with the aim of brokering a ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza. Well, according to sources, those talks have been making progress and have entered what's been described as the final phases. Well, the deal would be the first step of a multi-phase plan, and in this first phase, Hamas would release the most vulnerable hostages and Israel would pull back some of its forces in certain areas. This would allow some Palestinians to return to their homes and would lead to a boost in humanitarian aid. Well, in subsequent phases, the remainder of the hostages would be released in exchange for a lasting ceasefire and the gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces. But not everyone in Israel agrees with this initiative. The Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir says that such a deal would be, and I quote, a surrender to Hamas.
The deal that is being developed is a surrender deal to Hamas. I call on my friend, Minister Bezalel Smotrich, to join me and cooperate with me against the deal that is being developed. Otzma Yehudit does not have the power on its own to prevent the deal, but together we can go to the Prime Minister and inform him that if he passes the deal, we will resign from the government. I emphasize that even if we end up in the opposition, we will not bring down Netanyahu. But this cooperation is our only way to prevent this terrible surrender deal and to ensure that the deaths of hundreds of soldiers will not be in vain.
Itamar Ben-Gvir speaking there. Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak to Gershon Baskin, former Israeli hostage and peace negotiator, who joins us from Jerusalem. Great to have you with us once again on the program. We just heard there from Itamar Ben-Gvir pouring cold water on this deal and saying it's a surrender deal. How widely held is that sort of opinion?
It's a minority opinion. It's inconsequential and insignificant. Ben-Gvir naturally will vote against the deal. Maybe his buddy Smotrich will also vote against the deal. But Netanyahu has enough votes in the government to put the deal forward. That's not what's going to block it. There are still some technical issues to be negotiated between Israel and Hamas. They're difficult issues, but I think that we're going to see the finish line. The big difference this time being the role that President Trump is playing.
Yeah, you mentioned President Trump, and I was just reading a report by Middle East expert Nomi Bar-Yaakov saying that this deal between Hamas and Israel is very much driven by the inauguration of President Donald Trump. That seems to be sort of driving the timeline. It sounds like you agree with that.
Well, certainly. I mean, incoming President Trump said that he wants to end wars. He doesn't want to make new wars. He informed Prime Minister Netanyahu directly that he expects this war to be over by the time he enters the Oval Office. He doesn't want him at his desk. And what we've seen going on right now in Doha is unprecedented, where an outgoing U.S. administration is collaborating with an incoming U.S. administration from 2 separate political parties, working hand in hand in order to make this deal happen. So that President Biden can take credit for it in his last days in office, and President Trump can take credit for making it happen. We see Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East emissary, working together with Brett McGurk from the White House. And their messages, both to Netanyahu, to the Egyptians, the Qataris, and to Hamas, has been to get it done. And let's face it, this deal has been on the table since the end of May, but it's only happening now, a few days before Trump takes the Oval Office.
Yeah, indeed. There's been many months of negotiations, and we've been told before that we're at the very final stages of some sort of a deal, and it hasn't actually materialized. But you say this time it's a bit different. And you mention a whole lot of factors there, not least the timeline and the inauguration in 6 days from now. But the fact that Hamas has been severely weakened during these last 15 months or so, I mean, doesn't that mean that Hamas's negotiating position has been severely weakened as well?
It has, but they have the hostages, 98 hostages they're holding on to. And even though they don't have a strong military anymore and they can hardly shoot rockets at Israel, they certainly don't threaten Israel militarily anymore. As long as there's an Israeli military present in Gaza, they have guerrilla activities that are killing Israeli soldiers almost every day. And they could continue to do that for quite a long period of time. Enough suffering has happened. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed, 2 million homeless people in Gaza right now with no homes to return to, and hundreds of Israeli soldiers have lost their war in the extra months of fighting. This should have ended a long time ago. Hamas will not be able to rule Gaza after this war. Everyone knows it. Hamas knows it as well. A single dollar of international aid won't enter into Gaza if Hamas is in charge there. And everyone's talking about the day after, except for Israel. And that's consequential because Israel needs to agree whatever's going to happen there. Israel cannot control Gaza. Israel cannot remain in Gaza. This war has to end. The hostages have to come home. And the price to pay for Israel is also releasing a large number of Palestinian prisoners that it doesn't want to release, but it will have to do that.
Just to be clear, of course, we're not talking about a full ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire at this stage. We're talking about this.
Well, we are kind of. You know, there is an agreement that there will be a 42-day ceasefire, and on day 16th, they will talk about the next 42 days. My understanding is that Hamas, until now, has not agreed to begin a ceasefire without obligations that the war would end at the end of the second phase. I am assuming here, and perhaps this is a false assumption, but everything in my analysis says that it's correct, that the Americans have promised the Egyptians and the Qataris, who have told Hamas that they will assure that the war will end at the end of the second ceasefire period. In other words, 42 days and then another 42 days, and the war will end. Israel won't go in. This, of course, could all break down. And if there is a breakdown in the ceasefire, then Israel can renew its fighting. Hamas can renew its fighting. But assuming that the deal is implemented, we're looking at what will be the end of the war. Because at the end of the second 42-day period, Hamas is required to release all of the Israeli hostages, or all of those that they can find.
Okay, so this phased approach that has been the Biden administration's preferred approach, you see that carrying on uninterrupted, do you? And not least because you mentioned that both the outgoing and the incoming administrations were working and were very much present at those negotiations. You don't see that being interrupted?
Well, the problem with an extended deal like this that's going to take 2 or 3 months to finish is that it could break down at any time. Any kind of catastrophe could happen. Israeli soldiers could encounter Hamas fighters, or the other way around, and people get killed, and then the warfare renews again and the deal is off. This is why the major problem with this deal is that in phase one, they're only releasing 33 of the 98 hostages, leaving 65 behind. And the war is going to go on, presumably without really fighting, but the war is not going to be officially over for at least 2 months. This all could have been done in a 3-week period, and it's a pity that it hasn't been done. I put direct responsibility not only on Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also on the American administration. The American administration negotiators who put forth this phased plan have stuck to it for months, even when they knew back in September that Hamas was ready to do a deal in 3 weeks that would end the war, lead to an Israeli withdrawal, the release of all hostages and Palestinian prisoners. But it was the Americans who really didn't buy into it and pick it up. They should have, because Hamas even said at that point that they were willing to turn over the governance of Gaza to a civilian, professional, technocratic government, which they would not be part of.
And Gershon, just to wrap up, I mean, just to summarize, really, we are hearing from Qatar, where the talks are taking place, that Israel and Hamas are, quote, at the closest point yet to sealing a deal. How much longer do you think we'll have to wait?
I think very, very soon. It could be today, it could be in the coming days. We understand that there's a delegation from the Islamic Jihad that's now in Doha or on the way to Doha. to consult with Hamas. Basically, Hamas needs their agreement because they're also holding Israeli hostages. So I think we're looking really at the end of the deal. The Israelis have some problems to overcome with the issue of releasing Palestinian prisoners, but we're really, really, really close now.
All right, Gershon Baskin, a pleasure talking to you as always. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Now, moving on to the war in Ukraine. Now, some estimates have suggested that somewhere in the region of 10,000 North Korean troops could be in the region fighting on the side of Russia. Well, the Russian President Vladimir Putin seems no longer to be denying their presence. And at the weekend, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted photographs of 2 captured soldiers who were said to be from the secretive communist country. And he added that Ukraine was willing to take part in a prisoner swap. Well, it's also being claimed that many soldiers from North Korea have been instructed to resort to some extreme measures in order to avoid capture. So what is the truth? And what difference are Pyongyang's troops making to Russia's war effort? Well, to help us answer those questions, we're joined now by Robert Fox, defence correspondent for the London Evening Standard. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Ukraine says that somewhere in the region of 10 or 11,000 North Korean fighters are on the ground there in Ukraine and on the border with Russia. How much of a game changer do these soldiers actually represent on the battlefield?
Not much as far as can be told at the moment. And of course, it is quite a lot of it is anecdotal. A lot of the information is coming from Kiev itself. But of course, we do have aerial pictures. We do have video verification. And there's no doubt that they have been used in open fighting, infantry fighting across open ground where they've been faring very badly. They have been killed and injured in quite large numbers. Some of the casualty calculations are really quite high. If you have a total potential force of 11,000, about 3,000 plus have been killed and injured so far.
Indeed, that's the same number that I was reading as well, 3,000 claimed by Kyiv to have been killed so far. I mean, do you think, given that high casualty number, North Korea will simply send more? And do they have more soldiers they can readily send?
They have an awful lot of soldiers. They have well over 1 million, and they can spare them, and that has been made clear to Vladimir Putin. What the learning curve is the big question. We understand that they've had difficulties in communication, obviously language problems, and also the language of data. And that leads to the conclusion, which is very evident, that they're finding it very difficult to combat drones. The North Koreans are finding it very difficult to work with drones and against drones in the combat zone, which, as you seem to hint, is largely around the Kursk pocket. That's where they were brought in. It wasn't the prime purpose for them being sent there, but it was rather a desperate measure where things, again, very much the pattern of Putin's war. Russia is pushing back, but it is not going to plan, because over the past 10 days, the Ukrainians appear to have been quite successful in a counterpunch, and a counterpunch unusually in which they have been using armor, Western tanks, relatively unscathed, and that's the point, in this open area, which shows that the drone warfare, the aerial warfare, and so much of the close fighting has been controlled by immediate close air coverage by drones. That seems less effective now.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to how both sides are faring on the battlefield in just a moment, in particular what that's going to mean for any upcoming negotiations. But just sticking with North Korea for a little bit longer, I just want to ask you why it is, you think, that some military analysts are saying that Russia is treating these North Korean soldiers like cannon fodder. What's the reason for that line of thinking?
I think it's quite irrational. I think there's absolutely no doubt about it in the way that the Russians have contempt for foreign soldiers and foreign mercenaries, though being of a very mixed nature themselves. The homegrown, home-generated army, with its Chechens, with its Asian forces, and so on. And I think that they've just thrown them into the front line faute de mieux, because they didn't want to do anything else. Because the problem with Russia seems to be relying on numbers, but this is the paradox. Putin will not rely on the number of a mass mobilization. Failing the initial attack from February through to May 2022, I think we have to acknowledge that Putin and his gang, with Gerasimov as the commander-in-chief and the then defense minister, very much a fixer, still important, though moved to another office, Shoigu, they managed to do a concealed national mobilization in which they called up 100,000. Now, he's not going to do this again because he fears the social tensions, but that'll mean sort of potential pocket insurrections. So he's not going to do that again. That's why he's going to find numbers by other means, if you follow me. And not very big numbers, by the way. And by that, I include African mercenaries as well.
Yeah, indeed, enlisting the support of more foreign armies. And I just want to ask you about these reports that North Korean soldiers are resorting to some pretty extreme measures to resist capture alive. What do you make of these reports?
Well, this has been given focus by a report on Reuters, as you rightly suggest, and in that injured soldiers or of the North Korean units, they've had about 10 cases so far, have blown themselves up rather than be captured. Now, this is a desperate measure where people were possibly facing death. But then the question has been raised, is the mental condition of these Korean forces and whether they have been completely brainwashed even before they got to their training grounds. And we know through the autumn that they have been trained by the thousand in 2 camps outside Vladivostok. There's a certain amount of satellite fixing verification that has absolutely shown that. And by the way, it has shown that through the autumn, with Moscow firmly denying that there was a single North Korean soldier on Russian soil. So the propaganda war is ferocious, voluminous, and pretty crude. And it's a very, very important part of that. Now, whether this is a suicide tactic by the Russian soldiers, which the Reuters correspondents speculate about. You know, it's a way of, rather like the suicide bombers that we've seen in the Middle East and elsewhere. I think it's very much open to question.
Yeah, indeed. No one seems to be denying that there are North Korean soldiers on the ground there anymore, although they did, certainly Moscow and Pyongyang dismissed all of that as fake news to begin with, as you rightly point out. Quite interesting.
Then they got the prisoners, by the way, and that means you get photographs.
Indeed, and
so they had to stop that. Yeah,
there's no use denying it anymore. And of course, Ukraine's released videos of what it says are 2 North Korean soldiers that have been captured. One of them, interestingly, says he wants to stay in Ukraine. And I'm just wondering what you think of that, because some analysts have said that if he goes back to Pyongyang, he faces a fate that, according to that analyst, is even worse than death.
Well, it probably would be death, actually. I think it's quite open to speculation that could happen. Yes, you've got the very strong point, because with North Korea, when you've got this absolutely almost science fiction regime there, and it is a military regime with sort of half nukes, because how effective their nuclear force is still open to question. That they've been developing one, there is no doubt, and they have warheads. But the thing that is their weakness is leakage of information, that information could come back. So they do not want returnees. And leakage, i.e. conjecture, is one of the biggest problems for North Korea out of this. Supposing they do, they're under pressure from Moscow, they do put tens of thousands, many times, not perhaps the 100,000 that has been speculated, though they can be spared, up to, say, 50,000. that's going to be a problem because it creates a bubble of opinion among them. And you will always have defectors there. There will people saying, oh, you know, it was like suicide bombers being promised paradise, eternal paradise in another world, in the Islamic world. You will have people who will become skeptics and say, look, it isn't like that after all. And, you know, we were told this about the Ukrainians and the way the Ukrainians operate. Because, by the way, it was a lot of the shock for some of the more eastern impoverished forces of Russia going into Ukraine, finding out how much better off the Ukrainians were than them. That's why they fell upon white goods, consumer durables, fridges and TVs and so on, in quite a copious manner. It was quite a problem. It is part of the information war, and it doesn't go all one way. But I do think it's worth drilling into the nature of the alliance between Pyongyang and Moscow, because we know there was the meeting and we know there was a mutual defense ironclad pact agreed, and they have begun to publish it. And we know that in Article 4, it's a mirror of the NATO Article 5 of mutual defense. An attack on one is an attack on all, and that is Kim Jong-un's excuse for sending North Korean soldiers, particularly after the incursion into Kursk. You know, that our great friend has been attacked. But it has ominous implications, which Putin himself has hinted at in 2 or 3 speeches, for igniting the semi-frozen or semi-Fredo war between North and South Korea, which has been technically under an armistice since 1953. But given the political confusion in South Korea itself, are they going to have a go? That's certainly what South Korean military fears.
Indeed, and just going back to that soldier who says he doesn't want to go back to North Korea, he wants to stick around in Ukraine. I mean, that's a bit of a humiliation, isn't it, for the Russians and the North Koreans? And as you say, it's a liability. That soldier could hemorrhage information and perhaps even swap sides, although that's entirely speculative. What do you think China makes of all of this? Because, of course, China's a key voice I mean, one of the most important voices in Asia, militarily speaking, and all of this is happening in its backyard.
What China is up to is quite a mystery still, because in a way it doesn't want the Ukrainian war to go on forever. It welcomes it as a disruption of that well-known word, the hegemony of the West, and it talks peace, but at the same time is doing quite a bit of help, sanctions busting, sending in dual-use material, which is vital for guidance systems for drones and glide bombs and the like, so much so that we understand that a special railway has been built, or rather refurbished, to connect Russian and Chinese territory to feed the production of drones and other material, particularly going as far west or east of Moscow in the zone around Tatarstan, which is the Tatarstan bases, the 1 or 2 bases there, which are actually vital for drone production. And this is where the game is going at the moment. But it is quite clear that in all this, China is the senior partner, and it will be watching what happens, what the play out is between Russia and America now that we get Trump coming in, and what this leads to in the wider context, and above all, not just Ukraine, not just the Caucasus, in which the latter, China really has quite a marginal interest, except for the generation of oil and gas, which it is thirsty about. But it's what happens in the Arctic and what happens right across the Arctic loop going into Europe. And this is where Greenland stops becoming a joke, because China has a great deal of interest in Greenland, has already won concessions, is after the mineral wealth there, and obviously wants to join Russia in controlling the northern passages, and that is now becoming, it's at first you tell a story as a joke, then you play it as fast, and then you tell the truth. The polar contest, and not forget the Antarctic region, and that's a whole other story, but it's very important for China as well. This is becoming a new area, but we're now beginning to see what we will see within the next 6 months behind what we're focused on immediately in the Middle East and in Ukraine. We will see China showing its hand. And I think it will be quite a strong hand. And I think that's where that's going to be the test for Trump. And it's why, coming back to where we are on Ukraine, Trump desperately wants a deal in Ukraine. And for all kinds of reasons, which we may have a bit of time to explore, Vladimir Putin does not.
Do you think that explains, obviously with the inauguration of Donald Trump less than a week away now, do you think this explains why perhaps there's been an uptick in momentum by the Ukrainians to make as much ground to galvanize their position in as much territory as they possibly can before he takes office, and using some weaponry that perhaps they won't be allowed to use after the 20th of January? And I'm talking about those Akermans, the ballistic missiles, and also the UK-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles. A whole load of them have just been fired at Russia today, plus 146 drones. I'm just wondering, do you think there is this sense that we've got, from the Ukrainian point of view, we've got to make as much ground as we can before Inauguration Day, because after the 20th of January, perhaps there'll be less of a carte blanche to do what we want?
I think timing is very important, and it does happen to coincide with the timing for the Trump inauguration. But there's another matter with the deep strike weaponry, the ATACMS, the Scalp, and the Storm Shadow, is that Kiev is worried that the West is just going to run out. It's not going to provide enough, and that's why they're making such efforts in domestically, that their arms industry is now believed that, within a few months, that Ukraine will be producing and capable of producing more drones than the whole of the European and NATO alliance put together, and it is way ahead there. Zelensky is very shrewd, and he knows that, he's got to play Trump. And Trump knows that, and he doesn't like Zelensky, as we know, and he's made his dislike absolutely plain. Zelensky has several problems. His real problem, actually, on the front line is the PBI. It's the poor bloody infantry. They are very, very stretched with infantry, and people do not volunteer for the infantry. They have a horrible time. The problem in depth with him is the kind of society that you've got in Ukraine. I understand that there is this, it's partly still, you can see it in the armed forces and the see it in which civil administration is organized. It's still got quite a long Soviet hangover. It's a thing that's not credited enough, but I'm hearing this constantly from observers and indeed advisors to Kiev. It's the disengagement of society, that people want to avoid this war. They found at the outbreak of hostilities, or the renewal of hostilities, should I say, in the February 2022, there were about 2 or 3 million people who'd gone into the civil society, who were very active in the academic world, who were barely registering. They weren't registered in the way they were out in the more rural communities, the rural hub towns, where they were registered, regimented, understood from schooling through in a sort of Soviet way. And it's the engagement of civil society, which is going to be, and is quite apparently, a huge problem for Putin, for Zelensky now, correction, Freudian slip. And the problem will be for him, Zelensky, to engage Europe, to get Europe to think as an alliance apart from Trump, because Zelensky is plenty shrewd. He really understands what's happening. The NATO that we see today on the eve of the second inauguration of Donald Trump will not be the NATO we'll be looking at in 6 months' time. It's going to be very, very different indeed. In fact, there are forward thinking in the Western strategic community, the European strategic community, led by a bunch of Brits, the likes of Julian Lindley-French, Professor Julian Lindley-French, and of the Alphen Group, and several defense chiefs who say, look, we've got to play it different. We've got to have a different approach to the the Charter. America is very powerful. It is the leader, but it's not clearly capable of a lead in everything.
And when it comes to an end to the conflict, which Donald Trump has been pledging for quite some time now, I mean, how quickly do you think that's going to come after the 20th of January, and at what sort of a price to Ukraine?
Well, the simple word in war and peace, in hope and death, in the Ukraine conflict, particularly the ground war, which has been going on for 3 years now, is grind. It'll be a grinding war and a grinding peace. And I think we've got to really sort of retool the hackneyed phrases, the cliches of warfare, particularly things like hybrid war and frozen conflicts and things like that. It will die down. There will be some arrangement. But I doubt they even get as far as a policed ceasefire line, which people have been talking about a lot, both Moscow and Kiev, with European NATO troops and allied troops patrolling this. I don't think that's going to happen. But do I think that Russia will go on? I think it has to, in a very peculiar way, because Putin has now built his tsardom, as it were, his regime around a war regime. It's not a war regime in an old format, because I've said it's multi-formatted, because they're fighting the shadow wars, they're with drones, with subversion, hacking, the cutting of cables, the threatening of big energy hubs, particularly sub-aqua hubs, the kind of things that the British government of Starmer and co, in public at least, feigns to be blissfully unaware and to be downplaying. That will go on. And unfortunately, we've got a generational confrontation with Russia, whatever Trump says. Trump thinks he can get a deal. Putin doesn't really want a deal because he deals himself out of politics altogether, and power, and probably life itself.
OK, and just lastly, before we let you go, I mean, going back to where we began, which was talking about North Korean soldiers, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, says his army is, quote, the strongest in the world. And certainly we look at a lot of propaganda videos that show large numbers of soldiers doing remarkable things like punching blocks of ice and all sorts of other stunts. How strong are they? What have we learned from this war in Ukraine with regards to the strength, the true strength of the North Korean army?
Every major army in the world in the last 10 years has been proved to have serious weaknesses. The point is, being in the business that you and I are in at the moment, we love blabbing away on the media. It is not clear. These deficits, the hollowed out nature of a lot of American forces, for example, the inability of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, on its record to fight a major maneuver war or even conduct a full-blown heads-up amphibious operation across 100 kilometers of the Straits of Taiwan is pretty questionable. And so we go right through the hierarchy, including the Kim Jong-un forces of, on paper, you read Janes, you read the military balance of the Strategic Studies Institute, that it's a 1.1 million at least, with about 3 times as many reserves. But whether that could function in the field, well, we've seen the deficit in just tactical maneuver and doctrine in Ukraine. And the remarkable thing about Ukraine is a hybrid army, and it's not what it's been cracked up to be in the media, because it's still not a modern army. It's still not an articulated army, and seems to fight on sort of quite small unit levels, roughly at brigade level. And if you go down through the NATO European armies, well, the British Army, for example, which is now really quite small, is completely hollowed out. The only effective military force in NATO, and it's trying to do too much with too little, aren't we all, is France.
OK, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Robert Fox, defence correspondent for the London Evening Standard. Thank you for your time. Now let's get the latest from California, where dangerous winds are returning to the Los Angeles area, and that's fanning the flames of the severe wildfires in that area. Well, the National Weather Service has issued a red flag warning, urging people to avoid burning wood, avoid mowing the lawn and discarding cigarettes, as these actions can quickly ignite wildfires. Well as the human and financial costs, these wildfires have also taken a significant political dimension, with the Democratic governor of California, Gavin Newsom, being severely criticized by the incoming Trump administration. Well, let's get more now from Bill Essayli, who is an assembly member in the California State Legislature, who joins us from the Sacramento area. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You represent California's 63rd Assembly District. Just to be clear, you're not immediately in the disaster area, but just tell us what the latest is you're hearing with regards to the situation in the wildfires.
Yeah, our district that I represent is not immediately impacted by the fires, but we are adjacent, so we're very much in the vicinity. Right now, the fires are still burning, and there's still new fires being ignited almost every day, and so if they're quickly put out, they can be avoided. But the problem we're having is it's the winds. It's extremely windy here, and with the dry conditions, if a fire starts, the winds just exacerbate it very quickly, and it can spread and become very wild and uncontrolled. So right now, what we're really hoping for is for the winds to die down.
Yeah, what we're being told is that an area the size of Washington, D.C. has already been scorched, and with no rain forecast, and you've got thousands of kilometers of arid landscape, plus those winds you mentioned. I mean, there's a really lethal combination here, and a sense perhaps that things might get worse before they get better.
Well, we hope not. But really, this is not new to California. California is very accustomed to having wildfires and these dry conditions. And so part of the criticism that we've had here as elected officials, and me being a Republican in California, is that we don't manage our lands properly to prepare for these conditions. We know these conditions come every year, but we fail to take the necessary steps to really prepare for it.
Yeah, and we've been speaking to experts on this channel as well, who say that the situations, we're going to be seeing more and more of these kinds of wildfire in the future. And he says that's the result of global warming and climate change. Is that something that people are talking about there?
It's very difficult to attribute how much of it is for climate change. What we can tell you is we've always had wildfires in California. It's nothing new. What's new, what's different are the conditions on the ground. California, we used to manage our lands. We used to go in and take the dead trees out of the forest. We used to let the lumber companies go in and thin the forest. We used to do controlled burns. We would burn the brush. We would burn hillsides in the safe seasons. So that way, when these conditions came, there would be big fire breaks, or there wouldn't be as much fuel on these lands to burn as quickly. We used to have better infrastructure, and we used to have water in our reservoirs. The firefighters didn't have water in the fire hydrants to fight the fires. So none of what I mentioned is attributed to climate change. That's all man-caused disasters. Particularly, we're very critical here because California's been under the control of the Democrat Party for like the last 20 years.
Yeah, and we've been hearing a lot from President-elect Donald Trump accusing California officials of incompetence. It sounds like you agree with what the president-elect is saying. And I'm just wondering, how widely shared is that opinion across California?
It's extremely widely shared. Even people in LA, the area impacted is LA. It's a lot of celebrities. It's traditionally a very affluent, progressive, liberal, Democrat area. And they've now come out in criticism, not only of the governor, but also the mayor there, who was voted in overwhelmingly. So it's really shifted a lot of people's perspectives, because I don't think people appreciated how unprepared and how incompetent our leadership really is. Again, to have a fire and not have water in the fire hydrants, I can't underestimate how bad that situation is. I mean, they could have saved a lot of homes and residences if we had basic things like water. I always compare, Dubai is a desert. You have plenty of water. You turn on your sink, water comes out. California has not invested in water storage or infrastructure in a long time. We proposed a desalination plant off the coast of the Pacific Ocean. That was rejected by these, what we call extreme environmental policies. They just don't want to do it. And so this is a big problem.
Yeah, you've been calling for your state to be fireproofed. I'm just wondering whether you can tell our viewers what it means to fireproof California.
Yeah, so it's a change of two things. One is what we spend our money on, and two, our policies. So For example, in 2021, we spent $1 billion on fireproofing, or I'm sorry, fire prevention. That's thinning brush and things like that. We now only spend 200 million. So there's been an 80% reduction in the budget on just basic things like fire prevention. We need to be investing a lot more than that, probably several $billions a year. We need to upgrade our infrastructure, not only our water infrastructure, but also our power lines. So you have to, California's been around a long time. We have power lines that are over 100 years old that have not been updated or maintained. And sometimes a lot of these fires get started when the wind blows these power lines down, and they start a lot of the fires. So we need to upgrade our infrastructure, our water infrastructure, our power lines need to be undergrounded or upgraded. We need to change our rules so we can get back to thinning the forests or doing these prescribed burns, lowering the fuel load. There's a lot of things we can be doing as a government that we're just not doing right now.
Yeah, with regards to putting out the fires, we've heard from President-elect Donald Trump saying, quote, "They just can't put out the fires. What's wrong with them?" he said on Truth Social. I mean, we've got 8,500 firefighters on the ground. I'm sure they're doing their best. Some of them are in the air, I should add as well. But this is one of the most devastating natural disasters in US history. And clearly, putting them out, I mean, they'd put them out if they could, but this is a massive challenge. I mean, is that kind of rhetoric helpful coming from the president-elect, sort of suggesting that it's a simple task and they're not up to it?
You know, I think what's frustrating to people like me and the president-elect Trump is that this is not the first we do this every year. We've had devastating wildfires. The biggest wildfire was a few years ago in the state of California. And every time the federal government steps in to help and to give billions of dollars to recovery, but what the president-elect wants is he wants a change in policies. He gives this money over and he says, okay, but now you have to fix it. Now you got to make sure this doesn't happen again. So here we are again in 2025. We have another season, wildfire season, and we still don't have water in the reservoirs. We still haven't managed the forest. We still haven't done the basic things. So yeah, it's very hard to put out a fire without water. It's very hard to do these things. So I think the president-elect is absolutely right to be critical of this government, which refuses to make basic changes to our policies because they don't want to upset the environmentalists in our state. That's what this is all about. We have radical environmentalists who do not believe we should be touching the forest, we should be messing with Mother Nature, we should be putting desalination in the ocean. And I want to tell you, I'm for the environment, but we have to be able to develop and do basic things as humans, which they're not letting us do. And let me just say, if you believe in the environment, these wildfires are the worst thing for the environment. We put out more carbon in 2020 through wildfires than we saved in California over the last 20 years. So everything we're doing to combat climate change has been erased by these wildfires. The black carbon, the pollution coming out of these things is horrific for the environment and the air quality. So we need to be smarter about how we manage ourselves as a state.
Yeah, so clearly you and the president-elect believe that at a state level, this crisis has not been managed how it should have been, and that it was in many ways preventable, if not entirely preventable, somewhat less severe than it has been.
Well, can I just give you a quick example of what Gavin Newsom, our governor, is busy with? So instead of right now, I'm in the legislature, so we should be doing nothing right now but figuring out how to help these victims and make these changes and prevent this from happening. Instead, he's convened a special session. So he wants us to spend $50 million so he can start suing President Trump on the first day he gets elected in office. This is the type of politics that our government and the Democrats are involved in. They're obsessed with President Trump and getting him. So we as a body are busy having hearings and doing a special session so we can have a legal fund so we can start suing the president on the very first day he gets sworn in. This is what they spend their time and energy on. That's what frustrates us.
Sure. I mean, it clearly isn't the time to be pointing fingers. I mean, in the middle of a massive disaster, a tragic disaster for thousands of households in California. But both sides have been doing it, to be fair. I mean, we are seeing quite a bit of finger pointing coming from the GOP.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you call it finger pointing. We call it accountability. I mean, it's important that the public understands that these things are preventable.
Yeah, but is now the time? Is now the time for that kind of...
Yes, it is the time. It is the time. When someone's house is being burned down, they need to know who's responsible for that. That is not just Mother Nature. That was failed government and incompetence. Yes, They need to know exactly who's responsible. It's the governor and the mayor, and you cannot point at Republicans because Republicans have had no power in the state of California for over a decade now. The Democrats have the governor's office, they have the legislature, and they have the mayor's office. So there's nothing to point at Republicans. We've not even been in a position to do anything for over a decade.
So do you think, given what you've said, that there will be heads that roll? I mean, basically I'm trying to say, do you think people should and will step down from their positions as a result of how this has all been handled?
I really hope they will be. I think the mayor is facing a lot of pressure, Mayor Karen Bass. She left the city knowing that this weather event was approaching to go to Ghana. And so she said, well, I was on the phone and this and that. Well, people don't want a mayor working remotely when there's a disaster like that. So she's facing a lot of criticism. She's facing criticism for, her fire hydrants not working and other things. Gavin Newsom is termed out. He only has 2 years left in office. He has aspirations to run for president. That's why you see him particularly sensitive right now and being very defensive, because he knows this disaster has the ability to extinguish or end his political aspirations. And he's more worried about that than actually helping these victims and getting a solution to California to fix these problems. He's been governor for 6 years, and he's done nothing to prevent this.
Sure. Well, in terms of just looking forward, and this is my last question to you, I mean, what are the lessons that have been learned so far, and what needs to be done? And this may require, recapping some of what you said earlier on. What needs to be done to make sure that next time there are wildfires, they're not quite as severe as these ones?
I think for me, the biggest lesson is that, yes, you have to be good stewards of the environment. We have to protect our environment, but you have to make sure that the policies you're using in name of the environment aren't making things worse. And I think we've really reached a tipping point here in California where our, our intentions, yes, are to help the environment, but the effects are the opposite. So we really need to evaluate our approach to how we manage our land, how we manage forests, and what rules and regulations we have in place that are keeping our firefighters from doing things like prescribed burnings, from doing burns when it's safe to do so to clear out a lot of the brush. We just have to reevaluate our environmental policies and make sure they're actually helping the environment and not making things worse or hurting the environment. Like I said, we spent 20 years trying to reduce climate change gases and emissions, but it all got undone with the wildfires. So are we really actually making a difference?
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. We really appreciate it, and we hope the fires are soon under control. Bill Essayli, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
In other news, just days before Donald Trump takes office, Special Counsel Jack Smith has said that the only reason the president-elect isn't behind bars is because he's about to take office. Well, in a report published today, Smith, who led the government investigation, said that there's enough evidence to convict Trump for attempting to overturn the 2020 election results. But Donald Trump has hit back at him, calling Smith deranged, and he dismissed his findings as fake news. Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak to Nick Akerman, former Watergate prosecutor and former US Assistant Attorney, who joins us from New York. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That report released today by Special Counsel Jack Smith says that the US President-elect Donald Trump would have been convicted for his alleged effort to overturn the 2020 election if he hadn't been re-elected in November, and that he'd probably be in prison by the sounds of things. Does that all sound about right to you?
Sounds right to me. I don't think there's any question but that the evidence here was overwhelming. It ranged from testimony from people like his vice president, Mike Pence, to others that worked in the White House. I just don't think there was any chance that he would avoid conviction, which is why he fought so hard to delay the case, argue for presidential immunity, and do everything he could to make sure that the case never went to trial.
Yeah, the Department of Justice says the Constitution prohibits the continued indictment or prosecution of a president. So let's be clear here. This has got nothing to do with the evidence or the charges against Donald Trump, but everything to do with the fact that Donald Trump won the election in November 2024.
That's correct. And there's also the political problem. Don't forget, Donald Trump has basically announced that he's doing a hostile takeover of the Department of Justice, that none of the from the Attorney General on down, none of these appointees are going to be independent or people who will be deciding cases on their own merits. They're all going to be acting at the behest of Donald Trump.
So just to be clear, in a parallel universe, had Donald Trump not won the election in November, do you think he'd be headed to prison quite soon?
Oh, I think so. He would have been sent to prison in the hush money case in Manhattan. They think the only reason that the judge did not sentence him to prison in that case was because of the practicalities of the fact that you can't put a sitting president in jail because they can't perform their duties. I think where I differ with Judge Merchant on that is he certainly could have sentenced him to a term of imprisonment to be followed at the time Trump's duties as president no longer existed.
Obviously, the Justice Department has this policy of not prosecuting a sitting president. So when Donald Trump leaves office in 4 years from now, could this and other legal issues then start to catch up with him?
I think it's theoretically possible. Jack Smith had both cases, the classified documents case and the election interference case, dismissed without prejudice. That means that the case can be refiled. The practical problem with that is you've got 4 years that are going to go by. The question is, are the witnesses still available? Are they alive? Will whoever comes in next have the will to actually reset these cases and start over again and go to trial on them? It's probably unlikely that that's going to happen.
So Donald Trump's attorneys called on the US Attorney General Merrick Garland not to release this report that was published today. They said it was, quote, unlawful to disclose it. It was undertaken in bad faith and contrary to the public interest. I mean, what was the point of releasing this report just 6 days before Donald Trump is inaugurated?
Well, there's a couple of points there. First of all, Jack Smith was appointed under the special counsel regulation. That regulation required Jack Smith to submit a report, 2 reports in this case, to the Attorney General at the conclusion of both cases. That he did. Then it was up to the Attorney General whether to make those reports public. Here, there is an imperative reason to make these public because there's certainly the public is entitled to the right to know what was found on these investigations. And on top of it, you've got the practical reason that there's going to be individuals and instances mentioned in these reports that could very well relate to some of the Trump appointees that are going to be appearing before Senate committees for confirmation. And there's no reason why the Senate shouldn't have this information in order to determine whether or not to confirm some of these appointees. So there's the general right of the public to know, as well as the practical consideration that the Senate should know with respect to any of these individuals mentioned in either report that are appointed to high offices in the government.
Okay, and we've heard from Donald Trump. As I said in the introduction, he called Jack Smith deranged. He went on to call him a lame-brained prosecutor who was unable to get his case tried before the election. His words exactly. I mean, how damaging do you think this has been, this report, to Donald Trump's reputation, his credibility? Or do you think people who are supporters of him will simply dismiss it as being yet more evidence of what they would deem a witch hunt against Donald Trump?
Well, look, I think you're right that there's going to be a number of people that are just going to dismiss it because they'll blindly follow whatever Trump says or does. I mean, there is sort of a cult following around Donald Trump. I mean, that's part of the problem. But as all of this starts to build up, you've got the sentencing that took place, the conviction of 34 felonies in New York County. You've got these reports that are coming out. I think all of this, starts to build up and people start to pay attention to it. And the bottom line is these are not resume builders.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, obviously this is all completely uncharted territory for the United States, this level of scrutiny, legal scrutiny of a former president who's about to become a sitting president for the second time. I mean, does this now draw a line under it all for the next 4 years at any rate, all of these legal cases surrounding Donald Trump?
Well, there's no question about it. It's not just these legal cases that are criminal. It's also the civil cases that he's appealing. I think he's going to find that in most all of those, the courts are going to affirm the lower court's judgments. He's got the Jean Carroll case. He's got the fraud case that was brought by the Attorney General in New York. All of these things are still going to be percolating over the next 4 years. And it definitely is going to lead some people to second guess, whether or not they should have voted for Trump in the first place. We'll just have to see what happens, but this really is uncharted territory. It's never happened before in this country. And it's the first time we've ever had a convicted felon assume the office of presidency.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time and analysis. Nick Akerman, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.